afternoon, everybody. So last week I felt kind of bad because I didn't have anything that I forgot from the previous week to tell you. So I reviewed the Patrick Henry lecture that I did, and I found something. So what I forgot to forget, what I forgot in Patrick Henry was that after his famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death," it was an overflow crowd, and there were people outside watching through the windows. And there was one, Edward Carrington, who was the younger brother of one of the delegates, who was watching through the window. And once he heard this fantastic speech, and at the end, he said, "Let me be buried right on this spot." And he was. He died in 1810. He served in the Revolutionary War as a soldier, as an officer. And he lived his nice long life, and he died in 1810. And he was buried, and there is his stone is right outside the window of the building. So that was a good one. I should have told you before. So for last week, what I forgot to tell you about John Adams was that John Adams, if you look at him, he looks like kind of a frumpy, bit of an overweight, out of shape guy, but he was not. He was actually in very good health, despite the way he looked. He had kind of a big belly, but he was very vigorous and strong. He may not have been athletic, as we think of athletes, but he was very strong. He had a very strong constitution. One of the things that he would do when he caught a cold, he would go out, his cure for the common cold was walking 10 miles a day. And he felt that would cure him of it. And also about Abigail. Abigail, for many years, stretches of years, was on her own, tending the field, raising the kids, running the farm. And we have many letters going back and forth about how much they miss each other, and is very tender and loving. But she wrote to many other people as well. And there was one in particular who wrote some very flirtatious letters to her. And somehow this guy knew one of the pet names that John Adams had for her, which was Portia. Portia being a character from Merchant of Venice. Thank you. A very beautiful woman. And she reciprocated. She wrote back and signed her name Portia. Now, historians won't say that anything ever came of it beyond just the flirtatious letters, but it was interesting that she would actually do that. So, moving on, Thomas Jefferson. So, last week I compared the two, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and I made the statement that I thought, in comparison with Jefferson, John Adams didn't get his fair share of the glory, not having a monument in Washington, not being on Mount Rushmore and whatnot. And so today I'm going to talk about Thomas Jefferson, and I have to confess in making that statement that some of that is my own personal feelings about the two men. I have a much greater affinity for John Adams than Thomas Jefferson. John Adams had his faults. He could be a bit of a hypochondriac. He could be very critical of people and irascible at times. But I like the fact that he was always honest, or virtually always honest, as much as a politician could be. And he was very straightforward. Everybody knew that when you were talking with John Adams, you knew where he stood. He was not a hypocrite. Thomas Jefferson, for all of his talents and his vast intelligence, could be an awful, horrible hypocrite. And that, I think, weighs on me as far as my judgment of him. But anyway, moving on.
But he was the father of American archaeology.
Okay, that's something I hadn't mentioned in here. Thank you.
American archaeology.
Okay, so.
I'm an anthropologist.
Oh, great.
What's Carol saying?
She said that Thomas Jefferson is the father of American archaeology. So, it's not something I run into in the biographies that I've come across. Anyway, so here's the bibliographies that I have. This first one was put out by American Heritage. I'm sure you know the publication that publishes the magazines and is very esteemed for popularizing a lot of American things. That's a short biography. I found it interesting reading that in this series that they had about several different characters in American history, in this American Heritage series, that they did not hire historians to write these biographies. They hired writers, journalists to write these biographies in consultation with historians. So, but it's short and sweet, and it's mainly for the beginner. And so what I really like about these, and I may have said this before, a nice short biography, for me, it gives me a nice outline to work from. So I can see the major episodes in any particular character's life and build upon each of those and look up the ones that interest me more. Another one, fairly short read, Albert J. Knock Jefferson. Just a nice read. The next one is the really controversial one that came out back in 1974. Fawn Brodie, Thomas Jefferson, she brought up the old Sally Hemings issue of Thomas Jefferson having a slave with whom he had children. And so, and I remember, I bought this book a long time ago, back in the 80s, I think. I hadn't read it, but I had read other biographies of Jefferson, and almost universally, they condemned her for her awful historiography. She was not a very good researcher, and so because let's face it, a lot of historians really like Thomas Jefferson, and they do not want to hear negative things about him like this. I found it interesting for me in reading her that I don't think I've ever enjoyed a book that I've had so many disagreements with. The big problem that I have with her is that she uses Freudian psychology. So she delves into his relationship with his mother, and that for her relates to how he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And because, well, one of the reasons that she connects it so closely is that his mother died right before he was, just a couple months before he was writing. And so she connects it in ways that just don't make any sense, and other things along those lines. But it's a fun read anyway. Another really good one, 700 pages, Warren Stern Randall, came out back in the early 90s. The biographies that I have, I had to go back to each one of them to see what they thought of Fawn Brodie. And almost universally in the early 90s and before, they are pretty much condemning of her. After that, not so much. Anyway, the landmark one, if you want to know everything there is to know about Thomas Jefferson, Dumas Malone, 6 volumes, very in-depth biography. And of course, if you want to go to the source, there's many books out there that contain the writings of Thomas Jefferson. Okay, so he was born to Peter and Jane Jefferson. His father was a bit of a pioneer up in Virginia, starting his own plantations, thousands and thousands of acres. His father was a very intelligent man, surveyor, map maker, and they say he was immensely powerful and very intelligent and fairly well read for a guy who was not, who didn't go to college. He read the avant-garde of literature at the time, Addison, Swift, Pope, Shakespeare. Unfortunately, he died at the age of 49. Thomas was only 14. So Thomas Jefferson was born April 13th, 1743, Shadwell, Virginia. It was said that he claimed that one of his earliest memories is when they moved, when he was maybe 2 or 3 years old. They moved to Tuckahoe, which is outside of Richmond, in 1745, and he was being carried on a pillow by a slave. He started going to school fairly young. He learned Latin, Greek, and then at 17 he enrolled at William and Mary in Williamsburg. The sprawling metropolis of Williamsburg with 1,000 people was a thrilling sight for him. He was born and raised in the backwoods, small villages that it was, you know, Williamsburg for him was a big city. His friends that he made a lot of friends among his professors at William and Mary, Dr. William Small, George Wythe, and Peyton Randolph. So I got to tell you this. I was reading about his relationship with Dr. William Small and how the good doctor, after having a career at William and Mary, decided to move back to England. And this is in the mid-1760s. And through the years, Thomas Jefferson and he had a correspondence, and they were still good friends. Thomas Jefferson really looked up to him. But as the strain of the revolution progressed, Jefferson wanted to reassure Dr. Small that they were still good friends. So he sent him a shipment of wine. You should all know what kind of wine he sent. Madeira. And it wasn't just like a case of wine. He sent 72 bottles of wine to Dr. William Small in England. George Wythe was one of the 4 attorneys that Patrick Henry tried to get an endorsement from. And George Wythe, you know, he had to have, he presented to 4 different attorneys. He got 3 of them to sign off. George Wythe was not one of them. Peyton Randolph being one of the leaders of Virginia at the time, and we'll see as it progresses, he became the first kind of the president of Congress. And so in his first year of studies, he was probably a good student, but not too outstanding. They say after his first year, he became almost obsessed, or maybe I should just say obsessed, with learning, wanting to study at all hours of the day and night. And they say his typical would be about 15 hours of study. So, of course, Latin and Greek, for any classical education, you'd have to have that. But he learned French, Italian, German, and he was learning Spanish as well. And here's William and Mary as it stands today. And I've read that
Well,
yes?
you didn't mention brothers and sisters.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just didn't get into that. I apologize. I'll have to do that next week. You just gave me something to cover. He did have brothers and sisters. Yeah, I know he had a younger brother. I know he had sisters. But it's other than that, I'm at a loss here. And from what I understand, William and Mary is the oldest building in America that is still being used for its original purpose. So here is his general regimen of study. From sunup till about 8 o'clock, he would study on various days, not all at the same day, but agriculture, chemistry, anatomy, zoology, botany, ethics, and religion.
Oh my gosh.
From 8 to 12, he would study law because he was becoming a lawyer. From 12 to 1, politics, 1 to 4, history, and in the evening, he would study poetry, drama, and literary criticism. And he practiced the violin in his spare time. He once said that during a period of about 12 years of his life, and he didn't specify which 12 years, but during a period of 12 years in his life, he practiced the violin about 3 hours a day. He loved the violin. So he studied law for about 5 years and then became an attorney, which is very different from Patrick Henry, who studied for about 5 weeks. But Jefferson wanted to know it all. He not only delved into the Anglo-Saxon origins, but he learned Anglo-Saxon to get the original language of the law. And of course, Greek and Latin as well. He would know the origins of the Roman laws and the medieval laws as well. Took vast notes on virtually everything that he read. He would have volumes of his own notes, and he would copy out of various books, just an amazing amount. And he became a lawyer 1767. So in his early career, since he had good ties in the world at the time, he got a lot of clients. He worked with the Virginia legislature. One of the first things he did, actually even before he was a lawyer, he wanted to clear the Rivanna River up to Shadwell. His father had suffered tremendously not being able to ship his tobacco or wheat or whatever downstream from that from his farm up there. He became a successful lawyer, but he was never really into being a lawyer. He was very good at it, especially the paperwork. He could study and he could write, and he was very good at doing what he was doing, but his heart was never really in it. He did like politics, though. Martha Jefferson, daughter of John and Martha Wales, she was a widow. She was married for a couple of years. She had a son when she married Thomas Jefferson, although the son died not too long afterwards. They were married on New Year's Day, 1772. They had 6 children. Only 2 of them grew to adulthood, and one of those died at 25. So when Jefferson died himself, he had one of his 6 children still alive. Which again, as I say every time, it's not unusual at all. And there's the couple. It's kind of a shame that very few people ever did paintings together as a couple. And Monticello. How many of you know what that word means? So I just know somebody has to.
Little mountain.
Yes, it's Italian. He loved Italian, and once he learned Italian and he saw this place, he was going to build his house. So he was going to name it Little Mountain. So he began work on it, 1767. It was an Italian-style villa is what he envisioned. very common in those days, a neoclassical movement, which only gained steam as the years progressed. Every wealthy plantation owner and our own capital in Washington, D.C., everything Greek and Roman in their buildings. The style was a Renaissance architect, Andrea Palladio, and he worked on it. It was his baby. He was going to work on it pretty much the rest of his life, off and on. And I've heard various descriptions. How many of you have been there? Wow, that's fantastic. And as I always said, you know, I'm from California. There's not much historical out there. But now that I'm here, I've got to visit those sites. What's that?
I was told about New Year's that you could not even drive within the site to take a picture of 8 feet.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Take a bus. You have to take a bus.
Yeah.
What did he say?
Said that you cannot even drive within range of taking a picture of it without paying a fee.
Really?
Yeah.
So,
Get 'em.
yeah, and that's, I suppose that's, you know, life as it is today.
Who needs,
But
who needs a photo? Just get an old nickel. It's on the back.
look it up online. So I've heard, those of you who have been there, I've heard various things about it. One historian who said that this was just a magnificent building, the perfect household, and another historian saying it's a mishmash of various styles and unfinished projects that Jefferson put together.
Okay.
And I suppose it's somewhat of both. Yes?
I was just there last year, and I had been there maybe 25 years before, and it's so different now.
Yes.
Really? So he's still working on it.
What they have done is they have a whole section on the enslaved people. They're not
Okay.
called slaves, but
Right.
the enslaved people. And the history of the Hemmings family and
Yeah.
all the other families that were part of that, that community.
Okay.
And it's really worth it. It's a wonderful.
And they're building a new section that's deals with where the slaves lived.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Hopefully, maybe this next summer I'll be able to do that. And of course, he was very much into agriculture. One of the things that he loved most in life was the farms, the growing, the orchards, and growing various things. And there's Monticello.
It's a lot smaller than you think it was.
Really?
I remember the clock.
Huh.
I remember that.
So, Thomas Jefferson, an amazing, obsessive sort of person, vast intelligence. He kept notes on virtually everything that happened to him through the day. He took the temperature and would write it down 2 or 3 times a day. He could tell you when flowers are supposed to bloom, and he would record each an individual flower. And so these flowers are blooming on this date. These other flowers, they start to bloom on this date. He could tell you when the birds migrated. I've seen the first wren or flush or whatever bird comes and goes through the seasons, and he would make notes. The first one arrived today, or the last one left yesterday. Or bird migrations, the moon phases, of course, he always kept track of. The stars in their alignment.
So what's unusual about that?
Yeah.
Nothing.
Back then.
So of course the weather. He kept very strict accounts of all of his money and the food that he would have to give to his slaves, that he would eat, that his family would eat, that his guests would eat. He's very good at keeping track of all of it. Unfortunately, he was not good at keeping it. The money that he spent, he was always getting deeper and deeper into debt. One of the great ironies of Thomas Jefferson. He always used the latest inventions in farming. He was always up on what's the latest things to plant seeds. He, as you may know, he invented a type of plow himself and used it extensively. So here's a few of his inventions. A wheel cipher to create and unscramble secret messages, a revolving book stand, a type of dumbwaiter, an improved plow, a swivel chair, a polygraph so that when he writes, the machine would copy the same letters as he's writing. Now, some of these are not his inventions, but his improvement on inventions. I've heard that really the only two of these that he invented himself is the book stand here and the cipher. That others had invented the polygraph. Of course, plows have been around forever. He just improved it. The dumbwaiter and the swivel chair had been around. He just worked on it and made it suitable for his own use. And he, of course, Thomas Jefferson is famous for his contradictions. We all know how much he abhorred slavery, and yet he kept slaves. He bought and sold slaves throughout most of his life. They say he kept his slaves well. He did not beat them, but he did. It's interesting that some historians will say that he never whipped his slaves. It was his intention to never whip his slaves. He told his overseers not to whip the slaves, and yet occasionally he did have them whipped. A runaway slave, once caught and brought back, could be whipped. He hated violence, very much a peace-loving man, and yet he applauded the French Revolution despite the bloodshed that came about with it. And he made this famous statement, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Very polite, always gracious host, and friendly to all, and yet he didn't have a sense of humor. It was said by one historian that he would keep a we are not amused sort of countenance about himself. So he seemed to be a bit of a snob in that way. He didn't like foul language either, which is not a bad thing, but for those days it was a bit out of place for the company that he kept. He's around politicians, for Pete's sake. Very meticulous in his accounting. He could tell you every penny he ever spent. And yet, he was always in debt and virtually always growing deeper in debt. Never kept within his means. He loved farming. He would say over and over again how much this was what he was born to do. He loved growing things. He loved his orchards. He loved his farms. But he admitted himself that he was not really that good at it. One of the problems is not just that he spent more than he took in. He was just not good at farming, and he couldn't make a living at it. It was barely enough to cover his expenses, but then again, he wasn't very good at keeping his expenses down either. He expected loyalty from his friends, but he supported a horribly vicious campaign against Washington when Washington was president. Supported a guy who's publishing articles in the paper vilifying Washington. And this is as he is Secretary of State. One of the things I was going to read a letter. He's very loving, and universally people will tell you that he was a kind and gracious sort of person. And so you would assume that in his family life that would carry over. Between he and his wife, they would always, guests would remark about how much they seemed to love each other. He cared for her deeply. She was always, or almost always, fairly ill. The 6 children that she bore wore heavily on her. The one daughter that, actually he had 2 daughters grow up. I have a letter here to one of his daughters as he was leaving to go to France. He wrote to her in explaining to her his expectations. I expect you will write to me by every post. Inform me what books you read, what tunes you learn, and enclose me your best copy of every lesson in drawing. Take care that you never spell a word wrong. It produces great praise to a lady to spell well. I have placed my happiness on seeing you good and accomplished, and no distress which this world can now bring on me could equal that of your disappointing my hopes. She's about 10 or 11 at this time. If you love me then, that's something you should never say to your kids. If you love me then, strive to be good under every situation. No one in this world can make me so happy or so miserable as you. So
how old was she when they got married?
This is his daughter.
That's a daughter.
this is a daughter.
Daughter.
Yeah, yeah,
Not the wife, the wife.
yeah. So it's always difficult telling the difference between something that somebody writes and how they actually interact with the people they write to. This does not sound good. But who's to say that in her presence he was not a very loving and kind person? We don't know.
Was that Patsy that went to France?
Yeah.
That was
Question.
Yes.
What were the issues that brought on this campaign against Washington?
Well, his disagreement. When Washington, as president, you had Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury and Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. They clashed over a lot of things. And so Washington usually sided with Hamilton. And so there's a lot of things, handling the Bank of the United States, securing the debts. Those things Jefferson had just great problems with, as a lot of the South did. And so, he supported a newspaper that printed horrible, libelous, awful things about Washington.
Fake news.
Yeah, talk about fake news. It's nothing compared to what they had back in those days.
No.
Okay, so he was chosen to be on the First Continental Congress, and he was on his way. He actually wrote a pamphlet for it he was going to share with everybody, and then on the way he got dysentery and turned around and went back. But he had written out this pamphlet, Summary of the Rights of British America, and he was going to present that. But instead, he gave one copy to Patrick Henry and another one to Peyton Randolph. So Jefferson says later, Patrick Henry either forgot or just didn't care and never gave it to anybody. But Peyton Randolph did, and it got published, and he became a bit of a celebrity in the Congress, even though he wasn't there. So on the Second Continental Congress, he arrived a bit late, a few weeks after it had started, and he already had a reputation as a very good writer. So there was a phrase that somebody used for him that I thought was a bit curious and takes some thinking to figure out. And I forget the name of the guy who called him this, but he said, he is the best rubber off of dust that I have yet encountered. Who would know what that would mean. And he's talking about Jefferson being a great writer. He is the best rubber off of dust that I have yet encountered. Anybody?
Cleaning his library.
So, what I'm thinking, and I've seen this in older depictions of the time, when you write and you're using these awful ink pens, you sprinkle dust on it, and it sops up the excess, and then you can rub it off afterwards. That's what I'm assuming that he's talking about. But he developed very quickly a reputation for being great in committee. He would not speak in Congress, almost never, with the whole body. But when he was on a committee, he was, according to John Adams, he was prompt, frank, explicit, and decisive. And John Adams actually compared him favorably with Samuel Adams. He said even Sam Adams isn't better than Thomas Jefferson in committee. And that's high praise coming from John Adams. So, at winter break, December, he goes back home, and during that time, his mother died March 31st, and it was said that she died within an hour of saying anything was wrong with her. Jefferson described it as an apoplectic fit. She complained that she had a massive headache, and within an hour she was dead. So yeah, it's probably a stroke. And afterwards, Thomas Jefferson, who was known for having these same issues, he suffered for the next 6 weeks with a migraine and stayed back until May 17th. And on that, by the way, I'm sure some of you have heard that that's something that he suffered from horribly through his life, but it was only very occasionally. He said on average, maybe every 6 or 7 years, he would have this migraine. And certain historians will say, well, it's as a result of the stress that he was under at that particular time. And he never had it after he was president. After he retired from being president, he never had these again. And I suppose that makes sense. But the thing is, there are many other stressful times that he had between these 6 or 7 year spans that were very stressful, in which he did not have these horrible migraines. So it's hard to say. So of course he was on the Declaration Committee. Once he arrived, however, at the Congress, he found out that Virginia had their own Continental Congress, or their own Congress that was going to create a new government for Virginia. And initially he wanted to go back to help them make this constitution for their state. They did not want him to, of course, because they wanted him to write the Declaration. But he drew up a constitution for Virginia during this time and sent it to them a bit too late. But so anyway, as I've gone over before, there was the Committee of Five. John Adams, Ben Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. Once the five of them got together, they created the subcommittee of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And then the two of them, this is something I didn't mention last week with John Adams. The two of them supposedly, and there's different accounts of this. John Adams said that the two of them got together and said, so John Adams says, Thomas, you need to write this. And Jefferson saying, well, why do I need to write this? And so John Adams says, first of all, it should be a Virginian. Virginia has taken the lead in this, and it will be accepted better if a Virginian has written this. If I write it, they're not going to like it too much because there's a number of people who really don't like me. I could be a fairly unpopular person. And secondly, you're a much better writer. You write 10 times better than I do. That may have been the reason. It may be just that John Adams had way too many other things to deal with, that he didn't want to write it. But Jefferson said, yes, sure, he'll write it, and he did. Here's the 5 men presenting the Declaration. And he worked on it for approximately 2 weeks, June 13th through the 28th. And I like this statement from Jefferson, what the purpose of the Declaration is: to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent. He also used, and one of the criticisms later on that Jefferson received about the Declaration was that there's nothing original about it. He copied the ideas mainly from John Locke, that we've talked about before, but from others as well. And the people who didn't care for Jefferson would just say, that's hackneyed stuff. You stole ideas from other writers and you put it together as your own. And Jefferson would say, yeah, I did. I was not trying to come up with something original. Here's the statement. I just wanted to have this forceful argument in our favor. And John Locke, by the way, who is the one who coined the phrase life, liberty, and property. Jefferson thought it might sound better, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, July 1st, the vote was going to be, but they found that there were still 4 colonies holding out. They were not going to vote for independence. They did not have to have a majority for it to pass, but they knew, they did have to have a majority. They didn't have to have unanimity. They didn't have to have everybody signing on for it to pass. But they knew that they really should. Otherwise, the whole confederation, the whole group of colonies might just go their own separate ways. So, New York, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Delaware were still holding out. So, they sent for Caesar Rodney, and I talked about this last week. Caesar Rodney was an old grizzled Delaware man who had gone home. There were 2 delegates left from Delaware, one of them in favor, one of them against. So they sent a rider to fetch Caesar Rodney 80 miles away, and he made it just barely in time the next day, riding all night long. South Carolina decided that they were going to go with the majority since it seemed to be heading that direction. It was Pennsylvania that was key because a very powerful, influential state, and they had 7 delegates there. 2 of them decided that they would sit out, and so they had 3 in favor and only 2 against at that point. And so on July 2nd, they voted for independence, and New York abstained. So at least there weren't any against. And even New York, a couple weeks later, decided to join because they seemed like they were the odd one out. The next couple of days, they were editing the Declaration. There were 2 main parts that they took out. Parts of it they said that they didn't want to offend the people of Great Britain, so they removed the parts that talked about Parliament, a few, because it seemed to reflect on the people of Great Britain. Another part that was truly a ridiculous thing to say in the first place, they took out the part that blamed the king for the slave trade, as if it was entirely his doing that they have slaves in America. And Jefferson didn't like it. He didn't say anything. He didn't defend his own document, but later on he called them pusillanimous, who would take these parts out. Here's the Declaration. So once this was done, Jefferson was eager to get back to Virginia to help devise the Constitution of Virginia. He resigned the convention in September, took his family to Williamsburg to work on revising the laws of Virginia. Two of the first things that he wanted to deal with is primogeniture and entail. Who knows what that is? Primogeniture.
Primogeniture means the first child born, the first male child gets the property.
Right. So, of course, the purpose of these laws is just like in England. You want to keep, the aristocracy wants to keep all their property together. If you have, 5 or 6 kids alive, and, a few of them are boys, and you divide up your property amongst them, the great estates will be no more. And so in England, and was brought to America, this law of primogeniture, entail is along the same lines, basically keeping properties together, not allowing you to split it up. And Jefferson knew that if he could get at these laws, he could break up the power of the aristocracy in Virginia. And so those were the first 2 things to go, and he won out on that. The other thing was religious freedom. The Anglican Church in Virginia held sway, and it was against the law, as we've said before, to preach without a license. And who gets a license? Well, not many people if you're not Anglican. So Baptists were often arrested, along with others. Quakers and Presbyterians had a hard time of it. This was the other thing that Jefferson fought very hard for. He didn't get everything that he wanted, but he got a lot of it. And he reduced the power of the clergy, the Anglican Church in Virginia, over a series of years. It was not overnight. It wasn't like it was just 1776 and this is all done. This was a work in progress that took several years. He worked on streamlining the judicial system and promoted free public education.
Yeah.
Not like what we have today by a long shot, but it was a start. It was a couple of years that would be paid for at public expense. He liberalized the penal code, removed the death penalty from a lot of offenses. There were literally hundreds and hundreds of things that you could do that you could be executed for. The most outstanding one was horse theft, which was a real problem. And people got very upset when their horses were stolen. And so they fought very hard to keep that one. And they did for some time. But Jefferson said, let's just keep it for murder and treason, and the rest of them don't really need to be the death penalty. After initial work on the Virginia Constitution, he spent some time at home. Again, he loved farming, and he felt very concerned about his wife, who was almost always ill. He had a son born who died very shortly afterwards. And in 1777 through 1778, the prisoners who were captured at Saratoga, there were several thousand of them, they were brought down to Virginia, and the local towns were to take care of them until they were traded back to the British in prisoner exchange. And Jefferson made some very good friends amongst the prisoners. Some of them were German officers, the Hessians, and very cultured, very educated men. And Jefferson had a wonderful time playing his violin and having them to dinner. And of course, the Germans were very impressed, the officers anyway. But he helped build the barracks, helped them plant gardens for themselves, and had a good time with it. And then he became governor of Virginia, something that he probably disliked more than anything he ever did in his life. During wartime, it was his responsibility to keep Virginia solvent, which was truly an impossible thing to do. He was elected with a plurality, not a majority. He had two of his good friends running also, and they weren't really running against each other. It's just like each of them were told, hey, you know, you should really run, and they're like, yeah, sure, okay. Jefferson did not enthusiastic about it at all. But he had a great capacity for administrative paperwork, something that,
How fun is that?
yeah, something that I can't imagine, honestly. But he was very good. He could write reports by the dozen and just keep them coming. And he was, you know, his vast intelligence served him well. So some of the things that he would deal with, the new laws, Indian affairs, he would have to supply the militia, and he was in charge of the militia, public works such as roads and bridges and other things that the state owned, like some of the lead mines were owned by Virginia. He had to manage the budget. There were fortifications that always needed taken care of. There was a navy that Virginia had. And one comment that he said about the Navy being almost useless in Virginia, he said it would have been far better if they were just burned to the water because they cost money to support and they never achieved anything in his mind. So Virginia was under, you know, at the time, there were no western boundaries. Originally, Virginia was to go all the way across to the Pacific Ocean because they had no idea when Virginia was founded how far the continent, how big the continent was. So they just said, here's the boundary north and south and west to the ocean. And so they were taking that literally, even at this point. And so representatives of Virginia were claiming territories way up into Ohio and far western areas. Maryland, whose boundaries were set, was very upset about this and held out signing the Articles of Confederation until Virginia came to their senses and decided that they're not going to take the rest of the continent as part of their state. So they did, and they removed all of their agents south of the Ohio River. The capital of Virginia was moved at this time to Richmond for several reasons, one of which it was far less exposed to British shipping, the battleships that could come in and just level Williamsburg. Also, it is more to the center of the population at the time, and Jefferson was very keen on reducing the power of the aristocracy, the tidewater elites, as he called them, by moving the capital away from them. Yes?
I've forgotten, how long did the battles of the Revolution last, and when were the Articles of Confederation?
So the Articles, not long after we declared independence, they started drawing up these articles. They were not completely signed on, as it were, until almost the end of the Revolutionary War.
Which was when?
So
I've forgotten.
the peace treaty was signed and in place in 1783. Yorktown was 1781. And that was, you know, everybody knew that it was pretty much ended at that point, but the wheels turned slowly with the peace process. So they were invaded anyway, the first time by Benedict Arnold, who had recently changed sides, and Benedict Arnold was going out to capture Thomas Jefferson and any legislators he could catch as well. Fortunately, they were warned ahead of time. Jefferson, when he first heard that there were British ships in the Chesapeake, just sent somebody out to kind of keep tabs on him, and then realized that this was a massive effort to invade. and he lost 2 days of prep time calling out the militia because of that, and he was, as we'll see, harshly criticized. But once he realized that this was a real invasion and not just some scouting force, which he had thought of at first, he's frantically trying to organize the evacuation of people and supplies. There's tons of gunpowder that need to be protected, and many other military supplies and food and whatnot for the army. Jefferson himself escaped just in time, within just maybe a half an hour of being captured. Benedict Arnold, when he came, he asked for Thomas Jefferson. He said, if Thomas Jefferson comes to me and offers and allows me to take there's huge stores of tobacco also that he was going to take. If he allows me to take what I want, I will not destroy the city. Jefferson was not going to take the bait because he knew he couldn't trust Benedict Arnold of all people. Yeah. So Arnold did what he was going to do anyway. He took several ships. I think there were 10 large ships that he loaded the tobacco on, and 34 smaller ones, and just hauled off anything that had value and burned the rest. He came all the way up to Monticello to try to capture Jefferson, didn't do it, and so his soldiers ransacked Monticello, stole what they wanted to steal, destroyed a lot of state papers which were very valuable to Jefferson, drank his wine, his Madeira, by the way, and loved it.
Madeira.
And it's kind of funny too, I keep noticing this. I read an account of them raiding Jefferson's wine cellar, and the historian himself says they drank and destroyed his Madeira and the other wine. It's like you single out Madeira as something special, and then there's the rest of the wine. So
He had all these wines from France.
Yeah.
yeah,
He was very fond of them.
So the Madeira was imported wine.
well, Madeira, in case you don't know, I had to look this up because I was kind of interested in this. Madeira is actually an island owned by the Portuguese off the African coast. And so it's named Madeira because it's from the island of Madeira. And it got its flavor, they say, in the holds of the ships, because the ships would travel from Madeira all the way to India and then back again with the Madeira wine in it. And they say that in that atmosphere, it really does something that improves the flavor of the wine. So,
If you buy Norwegian
Yep.
aquavit, it says on the bottle, this wine was sent around the world and crossed the equator on this particular date and this
Wow.
particular day. Now,
yeah. Yes.
Finally gets around.
Yeah, that's what they say, that the heat in the hold.
Changed the character of
Yeah.
True, is it?
And as I've said, I'm no wine connoisseur by any stretch. I mean, I enjoy wine now and again, but it had a different flavor when I tried it. Very earthy, I think. But so here's Benedict Arnold. So again, tried to capture him at Monticello, loots his library, his wine cellar, state papers. He took 10 slaves to sell, and then burned the town of Chesterfield, which was a few miles off. And if that wasn't bad enough, another British officer, Bannister Tarleton, was well known as a very ruthless sort of raiding character, was going to capture the whole government of Virginia, the Assembly, the Council, and Jefferson. And they would have succeeded, except that when they stopped at a tavern, when they first landed, there was a guy who overheard the conversation and rode like mad through the night to warn everybody, and so he was not successful. Tarleton, as opposed to Benedict Arnold, was much more of a gentleman. He got all the way to Monticello and ordered his troops, "You are not to disturb anything. We're here to capture Jefferson. If so, great. If we don't, you do not disturb anything. And they didn't. Cornwallis, on the other hand, who a little bit later was raiding through the countryside, came across one of Jefferson's plantations at Elk Hill and pretty much stole what he could steal, took the cattle, the horses, and Jefferson was very angry because it was very spiteful, destroying warehouses, and even after he took the horses that he could take, the foals who were left, he cut all their throats.
Oh,
So it was just a horrible thing.
that's bad.
So here's Bannister Tarleton. He was very infamous for some other things that he had done. And there's Charles Cornwallis.
He was a fat pig.
Yeah. So Jefferson was governor for 2 years. It's year by year. Each year they were newly elected. After the second year, he had had enough. He was not going to serve anymore. And so at this time, right after he left the office, he was riding his horse, and apparently he was well known for loving to go very quickly on his horses. And the horse threw him, and he fell and broke his wrist, and so he was laid up for about 6 weeks. And in this time, not being the type of person who liked sitting around very much, he wrote notes on the state of Virginia. This was in response to a diplomat from France who was asking all of the colonies. He wrote to all the governors 23 questions about their particular colony or state now, and because he was interested in learning about America. Of course, Jefferson was the only one who responded. And so he wrote, which is now a very good description of Virginia at the time. And he wrote about, virtually everything: the geography, the geology, flora, fauna, religion, politics, history, and the Indians. And he refuted the claims of a guy with a very unfortunate name, Comte Georges de Buffon. And here's Buffon. So this guy in France made the astounding claim that in North America, everything, let me get this straight, a degenerative process in the species of North America that made men and animals smaller in size and less vital than in Europe. Here's a man who spent his whole life in France and was never in North America. But he wrote, he was a very well-respected scientist who wrote up this claim that in North America, animals, and of course the Native Americans as well, because of the climate of North America, they are smaller and less vital than the people and animals of Europe. And of course, Jefferson couldn't stand that, and in Notes on the State of Virginia, he made sure that he was going to answer those charges. And so he would capture animals and weigh them and measure them and let him know, our otters are larger than yours. The elk that we have in Virginia dwarfs the deer that you have in France. And the Indians, of all things, Indians are known for being tall and straight, very athletic, and show a great intelligence as well. So that was his answer. And there's Comte de Georges Buffon. Yeah, sounds too much like buffoon.
Yeah.
One of the great
Where it came from.
insults that Jefferson ever received was after he was governor of Virginia. There was an inquiry done as to his actions during the invasions and why he was not better prepared. And so this came out of the assembly by a guy named George Nicholas, but Jefferson was sure that it was Patrick Henry who was behind this charge. So he was charged with cowardice, incompetence, and a host of other things. And he was wounded very deeply. He said later in life that this was the deepest kind of wound he had ever received publicly. And of course, he never forgave Patrick Henry for that, because he blamed him. And he insisted on defending himself, even though he really didn't have to, because the charges truly were a political ploy to insult him. No real specific charges were ever made. But Jefferson presented his arguments at the assembly and defended himself well, but it was kind of a bit anticlimactic because there was no one really there to make charges against him.
Why Patrick Henry? Why was he the enemy?
I don't know. I haven't found any cause, any specific cause of, quarrel between them, but apparently they got to know each other, and Henry, for some reason, didn't really care for him, and Jefferson didn't like Henry. Jefferson famously thought of him as a very lazy person, but then again, compared to Jefferson, just about everybody's lazy. Patrick Henry was pretty lazy, though, as for what he was. His great tragedy in life, Martha, called Patsy, when she was pregnant with his 6th child, always a bit of a frail woman. She gave birth May 8th, 1782. Now this is the story that the child was 16 pounds.
No way.
We're not sure of that. That's kind of the family lore. That in any case, it was a large child. She lingered on for 4 months and died. She was only 33 years old after that. Jefferson was absolutely inconsolable. As she was dying on her deathbed, Jefferson passed out, and he was out cold for an hour as she died. And once she did die, he locked himself in his library for about 3 weeks and would not come out and see anybody. And once he did come out, it seemed all he wanted to do was go ride horseback miles and miles, and he would bring his daughter with him, and his daughter in later years would remember that she just shuddered to think of the violence of his emotions. She just couldn't bear to think back her memories of her father and how awful he was at this time, feeling for himself. On the other hand, this was a big change in his life. He claimed at the time, and claimed often, that he wanted to retire from politics. He was 39, and he served loyally, he served faithfully, worked himself to the bone, and wanted to retire. And that, he's told everybody, was his intention. Whether that would have happened or not, who knows. But once his wife died, he did enter back into politics. He was going to be sent on the Peace Commission to France with Ben Franklin and John Adams and John Jay, but he was a little bit too late for that. He was elected to Congress and served. He did become minister to France in 1784. And I'm going to pretty much end his life story at that point, and then go to Sally Hemings. The controversy that surrounded that began back in 1802 when he was president. James Callender, who was kind of a professional hitman in the newspapers, wrote up this story about how Thomas Jefferson had children with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, and he, in his words, it was common knowledge that these children were his. At the time, Sally Hemings, I think, had only had 1 or 2 children, maybe 3. So Jefferson never answered those charges. He wasn't about to give credence to these awful stories. Sally Hemings, a young girl, she's born in 1773. She was most likely Martha Jefferson's half-sister. They inherited several slaves from Martha's family when her father died. Sally was born just a couple months after her father died, and it's widely believed that Martha Jefferson's father was the father of 5 or 6 of Sally Hemings, I think, or not Sally Hemings, but the mother of Sally Hemings. She had something like 12 kids altogether, and they believe that her father was the father of about 6 of them. So Sally Hemings was what was called a quadroon. She was 3/4 white and only 1/4 African American, and was noted to be a very good-looking young girl. She served as Jefferson's housemaid, and she had 5 or 6 children. We're thinking 6, but maybe it was only 5. One could be just a rumor. 4 of them lived to adulthood, and all of them, the claim was, are Jefferson's children. Here is a supposed likeness of what she would look like. There was no paintings, of course, of her alive, but this is an artist's rendering. So as I say, the claims were originally in 1802. Jefferson was not going to answer them. His family, later on, in later years, answered those charges, saying that it was most likely his nephew that was the father, and that the timelines seemed to make it a possibility. In 1998, the DNA studies were fairly conclusive that it was not Samuel Carr, the nephew, but it was most likely Thomas Jefferson. Now, there's others who say that it could have been Thomas Jefferson's younger brother. No one at the time, when Thomas Jefferson was, or when his family in later years was defending themselves from this, no one at the time made that claim. That's more of a modern thing, that it was those who truly are great admirers of Thomas Jefferson and cannot bear the thought that he would do such a thing, are looking for reasons to make it not him. And historians, who are supposed to be very dispassionate about these sorts of things, had a very hard time coming to the conclusion that, yeah, it most likely was Jefferson. Nowadays, you will be hard-pressed to find a professional historian who says it really wasn't. It's pretty much unanimous. So, the Jefferson legacy. What did he think of his career? He could be sometimes a depressed sort of guy, and in later years sometimes thought that he didn't really make much of a difference at all. That if he never existed, somebody else would have done the same thing and possibly better than he did. But on his tombstone, his own epitaph that he wrote, the author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and the father of the University of Virginia were supposedly the things that he was most proud of. Conspicuously absent, of course, is being President of the United States. My feelings on this are that the ugliness of politics really soured him. And that's probably what he was thinking when he said, somebody else could have done this. And even some historians will tell you the same thing. He did many wonderful things. Being president was certainly not amongst his greater talents. So he was also proud of his work on the Rivanna River. But as I said, he was often unsure as to whether he made a difference or not. And here is the tombstone. Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, father of the University of Virginia. Any questions? Yes?
In 2 years after 1976, I was at an executive program for 6 weeks at the University of Virginia. They always refer to him as Mr. Jefferson. But I was surprised to hear you say he was poor. I thought he paid for the University of Virginia. It must have been governor's money.
Yeah, it was, yeah, I'm sure that he contributed to it from his own funds, but it was not entirely his. It was a public venture. Yes?
His library was the
Yeah.
foundation of the library.
Yeah.
Library of
Library of
Congress.
Congress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great
You know, one of the things about, of course, he loved reading. And like me, he collected a lot of books.
Oh, yeah.
Unlike me, he's read all of them. I have all kinds of books, but have not come near to reading all of them. But he did. Yes?
George Washington was also a planter, but he served in the army, he was a general, and so on. Was Jefferson compared unfavorably that he retired from the conflict and didn't take part?
I'll tell you, I was actually going to read something because he was, on a number of occasions when he would want to spend time at home, they were very angry with him and kept telling him, you need to come back and serve. We'll send the troops down and collect you if you don't. And here's a letter from John Adams to Jefferson. Pray come and help us to raise the value of our money and lower the price of things. Your country is not yet quite secure enough to excuse your retreat to the delights of domestic life. Yet, for the soul of me, when I attend to my own feelings, I cannot blame you. Adams was nicer than some of the others who wrote letters to him saying, get your butt down here, you need to join us. Yes?
When I was there in 1978, they were very proud of the fact that Queen Elizabeth had come 2 years earlier in 1976 to celebrate 200 years of independence, and they entertained us in this room, which is a dome at the top of the university building where they had entertained her 2 years earlier.
Oh, neat.
Nice.
Anything else? Yes?
The reason Sally Hemings was such a scandal, Virginians are probably the worst racist people you could meet. I went to school there, and in the charter at Sweetbriar, you cannot have any black people.
Really?
I'm sure that wasn't just Virginia, though. There's many southern states that had the same issues.
That school is now.
Yes?
Did Jefferson and John Adams die, both died?
Oh, yeah.
Same day.
That's,
Same
so
day.
you just blew something I was going to say next week. So yes, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Independence being accepted, they both died, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and so that was an amazing event for the nation as a whole. Looking as providential, sent by God, this is something that was truly an amazing event, both of them dying.
Is it true, as far as we know, that as Jefferson was dying, he said, and yet Adams lives?
I thought it was Adams who said Jefferson.
One of them.
Yeah, I could be wrong, but I think it was Adams who said Jefferson lives, and yet Jefferson had died just a couple hours before. Yeah.
John Adams was the last one to die.
All right, thank you very much. We'll see you next week. Thomas Paine next week.